Welcome, everyone. Welcome. We'll get started in just a few moments here in earnest. But as everyone is kind of coming in, I want to take a moment to talk about what is bringing us all here today for our program, Designing a Sustainable Future. My name is Jonathan Fanning. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm part of the community engagement team at the museum. And we'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening. And the main reason that we are here is as a celebration of the conclusion of the museum's Go Carbon Neutral Transportation Challenge. So this is the third year of the challenge, which is a professional networking and development opportunity that asks undergraduate students to propose transportation-related solutions that help us achieve a goal of being carbon neutral by 2050. The challenge is made possible every year through the generous support of General Motors, and the museum is proud to partner with a company that shares our mission to engage everyone in addressing the impacts of climate change. And in addition, for this year's challenge through the Museum of Science, we were also thrilled to partner with the Museum of Life and Science in Durham, North Carolina, and the Lawrence Hall of Science in Berkeley, California. And our 15 finalist teams represent all three of those states. So if you are interested, you can still see this year's finalist proposals at the website that is currently being thrown into the chat. And over the course of this program, we're going to be announcing this year's top three proposals and award winners. In addition, right now, I'm pleased to announce this year's People's Choice Award winner, which is the team that received the most votes from the public over the course of this week. And this year's challenge, we had over 2,000 votes cast in just a little over 3 days. And the most popular proposal as chosen by the public was from Angela Zhang, Kari Trailer, and Maiko Omole of Team Scale the Rail. So congratulations to Team Scale the Rail. Again, you can see their proposal in full in the link that we'll put in the chat, and our grand prize winner will be announced after the panel. And now a few housekeeping notes before the panel discussion. Over the course of this evening, if any of you would like to see captions, you can click the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. And if you'd like to ask our panelists a question, you can do so through the Q&A button, and we'll try to answer as many of those as possible. And at this point, to really kick us off, it's my pleasure to introduce the president of the Museum of Science, Tim Ritchie.
So good evening, everybody, and welcome to the culminating event of Go Carbon Neutral, the Go Carbon Neutral Challenge. And by the way, happy Earth Day to everyone. I am Tim Ritchie. My pronouns are he and his, and I'm the president of the Museum of Science. And it's our pleasure to serve as the convening organization for this event, along with our sister museums, the Museum of Life and Sciences in Durham, North Carolina, and the Lawrence Hall of Science in Berkeley, California. I'd like to thank General Motors for its sponsorship of Go Carbon Neutral. And I'd also like to thank GM for its robust commitment to create an all-electric future. GM has shown great leadership when it comes to creating a sustainable future, pledging to eliminate most of its gas and diesel vehicles by 2035 and by committing to being carbon neutral by 2040. The Museum of Science is also committed to doing all that it can to help build a future that is humane and sustainable and just. Through programs like Go Carbon Neutral and through exhibits that focus on the environment, we aim to inspire everyone to use science and technology to solve the environmental challenges we face, and to do so in a way that is fair and equitable for all. I'd now like to turn the meeting over to our moderator for tonight's program, Dr. Joan Fitzgerald. Dr. Fitzgerald is a professor of urban and public policy at Northeastern University and is the author most recently of Green Aviation, Urban Leadership on Climate Change. Dr. Fitzgerald's work focuses on urban climate, linking that action to equity, economic development, and innovation. Dr. Fitzgerald, it's a pleasure to turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Tim. Yes, so tonight's program has 3 panelists, and they're going to talk about transportation policy. So let me start by introducing our three panelists. First, we have Senator Joseph Boncorey. He served in the Massachusetts legislature since 2016, serving the 1st Suffolk and Middlesex district. He currently serves on the Senate Committee on Global Warming and Climate Change, Committee on Ways and Means, Joint Committee on Consumer Protection and Professional Licensure, the Joint Committee on Health Financing, the Committee on Housing, Ways and Means, and is chair of 3 committees. Senator Boncorey served on Winthrop's Charter Ordinance Review Committee and the Winthrop Housing Authority Board in the past. He is also a public defender with Suffolk Lawyers for Justice and practices at a law firm based in East Boston. Dr. Tracy Corley is Director of Research and Partnerships at the Conservation Law Foundation. She brings experience in research, public policy, law, and conservation to her role. Before joining CLF, Dr. Corley conducted research and convened stakeholders to promote equitable development in Massachusetts, gateway and regional cities as a transit-oriented development fellow at Mass Inc. That followed her mid-career graduate studies, where she researched economic development at the Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy, and then split her time between Boston and German Rhineland, investigating informal work in Germany's skilled trades. And of course, that work was at Northeastern University in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. She's lived in Seattle, where she conducted planning and coordinated a participatory program for formerly incarcerated workers at the Seattle Jobs Initiative, and founded 2 consulting firms that advance clean technology, sustainable development, energy efficiency, and advocated for inclusive economic development as vice chair of small business for the Seattle Chamber of Commerce. She has served many other roles within Boston on boards, most notably for tonight at Transit Matters. Geraldine Barnuevo is the Senior Manager for Environmental Strategies and Sustainability at General Motors. She is a native of Ecuador, and growing up there, she saw the environmental and health impacts of the Texaco oil spill in her community and became motivated to pursue a career in sustainability. Following her passion for sustainability, she came to the US to pursue her master's degree on a Fulbright scholarship, hoping to work with a large corporation to make a scalable impact. After graduating from the University of Illinois, Geraldine started her career at GM as an environmental engineer and has since worked for the company in Ecuador, Brazil, the US, and 8 other countries on various sustainability initiatives. Currently, she's working closely with the Chief Sustainability Officer on creating the vision behind GM's next generation of sustainability. So let me start with you, Senator Boncorey. And can you tell us a little bit about the newly passed climate policy and in particular, the transportation aspects of it?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Fitzgerald. And before I do, I just want to thank the Museum of Science for inviting me to join the Go Carbon Neutral Awards. It's incredible to have this discussion with Dr. Corley and Geraldine Bonnuevo on this panel. And I want to thank, of course, Museum President Tim Ritchie and his staff. I've been able to see this program grow from just a Massachusetts program to a New England program, and now it's a nationwide program. And it's just really great to be convening to have these discussions, and that the museum gives us the platform to do so. On one of my favorite subjects, the Next Generation Roadmap for Climate Policy. It's a bill that the legislature passed last year. It's a nation-leading climate policy package. And although we passed it last year, it didn't come to fruition because the governor vetoed it. However, under the leadership of Senate President Karen Spilker and Speaker Ron Mariano, it is the first piece of legislation that the legislature voted on this year because the climate cannot wait. And this bill goes very far in setting standards and sets statewide net zero limits on greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. It mandates emission limits from transportation at each 5 years to ensure we're getting to that 2050 goal, as well as setting sub-limits for not just transportation, but also for building and other sectors. It also codifies in law for the first time in the nation environmental justice provisions, defining what an environmental justice population is and providing new tools, protections, and hopefully along the lines of resources for affected neighborhoods, as well as, not just in transportation, but looking over to transportation is obviously the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, but buildings are the second. And this bill establishes a municipal opt-in specialized stretch energy code, which will define really a standard for zero emission buildings into the future. So we're excited that it happened. We're excited it's the first bill we took up, and we're looking forward to building upon it in this session.
Great, thank you. Let me go to Tracy in that in your position with Mass Inc. and a lot of the work you've done has focused on social justice. So one of the things we're doing in Massachusetts is a transition to electric vehicles, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we'll remove issues like congestion, inaccessibility, which of course disproportionately impact low-income neighborhoods. How can we ensure economic development incentives promote overall neighborhood health as we make this transition to electric vehicles?
That's a terrific question, Joan. And once again, I just want to also echo just my thanks for being invited to be here today and to have this conversation. I won't go through everyone who kind of made this happen, but thank you all. And yes, as we kind of think about, the pass of the bill, which I have to say the folks at CLF are also very excited about, and it's all kind of wrapping into kind of, the overall conversation of what we can do to reach the 2050 climate goals. I mean, the incremental goals that this bill puts into place kind of really helps to sharpen focus on how we can actually get there. But in order for us to actually get to those goals, everyone has to be a part of that process. And so whenever we look at some of the strategies that are included, and when you think about like electric vehicles, we have to think about just some of the barriers that some folks are going to face as a part of this process. There are a lot of people who live in housing that just don't have the electric capacity to be able to charge an electric vehicle, as well as when it comes to mobility, cars are just one of many modes that we need to be thinking about, many different ways that people travel and get around, that people need to have options, especially people who are coming from communities where they might not have the wealth to afford the $6,000 a year it takes to own and maintain a car, and that's a traditional car. When it comes to an electric vehicle, the car costs, we don't know kind of how that lines up. And so I think that that's something we need to be very conscious of. And so whenever we think about a strategy, when we think about electric vehicles, that should be a part of an overall strategy that includes electrification of as much of the transportation system as is possible, so that we have robust transit options as well as opportunities for mobility. I was joking earlier about my bicycle not being able to compete with everyone's cars, but we need to make sure that we have the infrastructure for that. We also need to make sure we have the infrastructure for electric vehicles, so that if folks do not have the outlets in their homes, and because we have, I think, a lot of folks need to recognize we have very old building stock here in Massachusetts, and it's going to take a lot to retrofit and upgrade these buildings. And so you can do that in new construction, but if folks are living in older building stock, it's going to be hard to have that nearby. So we need to make sure we have the infrastructure throughout neighborhoods, and not just in urban places, but also in rural communities and smaller towns, so that folks can feel very comfortable about purchasing electric vehicles. And then, of course, all of this is part of a broader strategy for making sure we're doing development that requires less of getting into cars, because we know that just all of the traffic, we think about vehicles and the damage that they do to environmental justice communities as they're known, those communities that are overburdened and under-resourced. It's not just about the pollution that the traditional gas vehicles have contributed, but we actually find that usually in communities, the number one problem is, especially during these times right now, is typically something like hunger, meeting basic needs. But the number two problem is actually accidents from pedestrians and cyclists getting hit by cars. And so I think that that is something that's very top of mind. And when we think about people's health, we need to be making sure that everyone can be included in this electrification process.
Okay, so interesting. We need state policy. We need, as you pointed out, there's an environmental justice component to that, and we need planners on the ground that can address the various issues that Tracy has pointed out. Geraldine, a very exciting announcement from GM on this rapid transition to electric vehicles. Can you give us some of the details on this all-electric future plan of GM?
Thank you, Dr. Fitzgerald, and all the members of the museum for, again, for inviting me to this panel and for giving me the opportunity to talk about GM's vision around our zero emissions future. I would like to highlight the importance of this topic and the issues around climate change, in particular in such an important day like today, where we are celebrating Earth Day. To achieve a carbon neutral future, as some of our panelists have already indicated, it's critical that government, industries, and individuals consider the impact of transportation on our all carbon footprint and work together on creating solutions, right? There is no one entity on itself that is going to be able to resolve the problem. At GM, we view sustainability as a core element of managing our GM business risks and being able to thrive in the future. During the last year, but since we have carefully reviewed and prioritized the areas of sustainability which are most relevant and material to our business. And that is how we are setting these aggressive mid and long-term goals targeted at this priority, being climate change one of the most important ones. These targets support our 000 strategy, which came to life in 2017. And back to Dr. Tracy, we not only look at a future and an all-electric future with zero emissions, but we think that it's possible a future with zero crashes and zero congestion. And it's important to consider, right, the advantages that technology and AVs can bring pretty soon to our society. In the past few months, we have announced a number of commitments to further align our vision of an all-electric future. Some of those include from a product perspective, our commitment to be carbon neutral in our global products, but also in our operations by 2040, which is 10 years ahead of the Paris Agreement. We are also setting science-based targets because we just don't want it to go with the claim without the backup of an organization as prestigious as the science-based target. And in the last year, amid of the pandemic, we committed $27 billion to the engineering and the infrastructure that is going to be needed to put all these plans in place. We are excited about, the future. We believe that, taking care of the environment is important, but most importantly, taking care of the people, because all what we do, it's, to thrive as a society in the future.
Great, that's exciting. Let's go back to policy. And Senator Boncory, in addition to the climate plan, the roadmap, we also have the Transportation and Climate Initiative that emerged out of RGGI. Maybe you can tell the audience a little bit about that and what it will contribute to transportation policy.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm going to state again that transportation is the largest contributor of greenhouse gas emissions. EPA has recently put out data to suggest that 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the United States are from transportation, Joan. It's really larger in any session. And in part, these emissions, which exacerbate climate change, are the result of outdated transportation technologies, from cars to buses, to trains to planes. And adequately addressing the climate crisis requires us to transform our transportation policy in the state, but in this region, in this nation, and really globally. And I think that the Transportation Climate Initiative, also known as TCI, it begins to do that. It's a collaboration among many states to create a regional approach in ensuring climate justice and environmental justice can become a reality. TCI will also create revenues At least 35% of those revenues will go to environmental justice communities in Massachusetts. I have a bill actually that raises that percentage to 70%, because I think those that have been so aggrieved by the emissions, those that are dealing with the medical and respiratory effects of these emissions, really should benefit the most from new revenues acquired, from the transportation sector. So I think, along with making vehicles more electric, by shifting people out of their cars onto public transportation, the Transportation Climate Initiative, too, as an added policy, will really go far to really make the substantial and sustainable change we need to impact climate change.
Great. It's and which states? I know there's the RGGI states, but which states specifically are involved in the Transportation Climate Initiative?
So initially, under the MOU, there's 4 other states, including Massachusetts and the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C. It's 5 states in Washington, D.C. California already participates in its own sort of TCI initiative. So there is a possibility to expand it across the country. But we're hoping to bring more states on. Some states where the governor has the authority, like in Massachusetts, to enter the Commonwealth into the Transportation Climate Initiative. Other states and commonwealths require legislative intervention to enter the agreement. So everyone's beginning their legislative session right now in the spring. So hopefully many other states will be joining.
Okay, great. So speaking of revenue generated, I'm going to turn to you again, Tracy, to ask about transportation financing. So if we look at the clean technology solutions, many of those have been around, as you pointed out before, for 20 years or more. So what do you think the policy challenges are that need to be addressed so that meaningful change occurs, and that the infrastructure to support these emerging technologies is equitably distributed?
That's another great question, Joan. Thank you again. And I want to say also thank you, Senator Boncory, for pushing for a much higher share of the revenue from TCI to go to environmental justice communities. I think that we also need to take a look at making sure that as carbon credits get swapped and we think about where facilities might be located, that we think about the disproportionate impacts that might have on a number of communities that are already overburdened. I think one of the things we've learned from California is that after they've done their analysis, that the evidence shows that across the state emissions have declined, but actually emissions in historically environmental justice communities have actually increased. And so we want to make sure that we avoid that, with TCI. But to talk more generally about finance, transportation finance, more programs like TCI will help to kind of get us the funding that we need in order to get us to building out both the infrastructure that we need to kind of make the transformation to a carbon neutral, if not a carbon not just neutral, but zero, which is, not offsetting, but absolutely, completely carbon. It would be ideal, that I'm such an idealist when it comes to all this stuff. But it would be great to be able to get to a point where we have the infrastructure to put all that in place. But the finance also needs to cover maintenance and operations costs. I think the one thing we have to keep in mind, as more and more people, I think now it's over 80% of the US population lives in urbanized areas, and that includes small towns or good-sized towns, concentrations of people. As more and more people aggregate in urban areas, there's not enough space for everyone to have a car. And so we need to make sure that we are investing in existing transit infrastructure, improving transit infrastructure, making sure we're being thoughtful about how we balance, transit infrastructure, pedestrian bike infrastructure, and car infrastructure, and then also making sure that all of these pieces have the financing and funding so that we're not in a position where all of a sudden, everything is breaking down, which is something, unfortunately, we've been seeing and experiencing here in Massachusetts, and trying to figure out how to kind of cobble all these pieces back together. The life cycle costs really need to be thought about as we think about what a financing package looks like, and making sure we have a nice suite of policies that make sure we have long-term financing for our transportation goals.
Yeah. So you two both spoken to multiple levels of looking at, policy and just all of the different concerns that have to be built into it, but also looking at a number of different states, California, Massachusetts, working with 5 other states. Geraldine, how does GM balance the sustainability goals it has on a global scale and adjust to these different policies and markets of different countries and states? You're muted.
Sorry, you will think that I have, have this down now. But that is a great question, Dr. Fitzgerald. Actually, our goals are global goals. We operate, in several continents and many countries, and we are striving to develop the technology so we can make this a reality across the globe. But we also realize that, some countries and markets are ahead, of others, and we try to adopt our strategy around those markets. But at the same time, learning from those experiences and taking those to other parts of the world. In terms of our most kind of our short-term strategy, our plan is to sell 1 million EVs in the US and in China by 2025. Those are the 2 largest markets. And 40% of the entries in the North America and the China market by 2025 are going to be battery electric vehicles only. So we are going to, this is our first step. It represents close to 18%, 20% of our portfolio, of our fleet. And we are learning and working with the government in other countries to make sure that the things that we need in order to scale these globally are present. We talk about infrastructure, right? Infrastructure is really important, and we understand that not the government is, has an important piece, important role to play in this, but we are also working with privately. We made an agreement last year with EVgo, and we're going to be deploying in the US hundreds of close to 2,000 charging stations across the country. But the investment that you need is very significant. Other areas where we need the support of the government, right, is in creating the incentives so people can even start to think about switching technologies from an ICE internal combustion engine vehicle to an electric one. We are doing that also, accelerating the availability of cars that people can test drive in our dealers and promoting that through our marketing campaigns, which, our campaign now is everybody in. Truly, we want to be inclusive in this transition, and we're offering a range of products, starting with the Bolt vehicle, which is our starting, our entry point, all the way to luxury cars. So there are, many things that need to happen, but we have people working with the policymakers and with other stakeholders in the different geographies to make sure that we can scale this, to hopefully global point, and at the same time that we have a strong performance in our main markets that are North America and China. Thank you.
So a lot of electric vehicles are going to be out there. I think there's additional legislation in Massachusetts that we haven't talked about to promote EV fleets. How fast will that be moving, and what is it? And does it also include taxis, school buses, and so forth?
Yeah, Joan, that's a great question. And I appreciate Geraldine and GM's commitment to creating more options for EVs for single use vehicles. But we also need to think about EVs as something everyone can have access to, no matter what their socioeconomic background is. And that's why the Senate last session passed an EV fleet vehicle that I was a primary sponsor of as the Senate's chair of the Transportation Committee. I've refiled that legislation again this year in order to create, a more equitable approach to EV adoption. In the Commonwealth, every mode of transportation, from school buses to DPD, DPW trucks, fire engines, name it. We need to put them on a path to 100% electric vehicles. And that's what the legislation I filed does. It puts all our fleet purchases and leases on a path to being zero emission vehicles by 2035. I mean, the equitable approach is something that we need to be very mindful for, because not only is there a lack of EV infrastructure in the Commonwealth, there's also just a lack of access to these vehicles, in every corner of the Commonwealth. So while prioritizing electric vehicle charging stations and environmental justice communities is very important, it's largely unhelpful with electric vehicles remaining unaffordable for residents in these communities. So by working to make public vehicles electric, we're really ensuring that there is equity in the change we want to see in the climate, and working with private businesses and car companies, manufacturers, to ensure they're creating an affordable option that all people can participate in is also important. But generally, the best transportation policy is to get people out of their single-use vehicles and onto public transportation. And I think the Commonwealth is leading the way in ensuring, as we build back out of this, global health pandemic that has seen, ridership dip, below 10% on a lot of modes of public transportation, we really need to incentivize people to get back onto public transportation. We need to get out of the mindset that public transit is a business model and think of public transit as a public good that serves the public, that serves, our public health concerns and our climate concerns. So that's legislation we're looking forward to work on this year. Legislation I'm calling the Transportation New Deal really sets a roadmap of steps we need to take initially to build to a more greener future.
Great. So speaking of getting more people on public transportation, one of the things that strategies that is used by city planners is transit-oriented development, where you try to build development nodes and around transit stations in order to increase ridership and to create what's often referred to as a 15-minute community or 20-minute community where people can get everything they need by walking or on bikes. So Tracy, I'm going to ask you about what you're seeing in transit-oriented development, whether in Massachusetts or anywhere else, particularly in how it doesn't replicate inequalities that already exist.
Thanks, Joan. It's interesting because, when we think about transit-oriented development in the 15-minute city, we have, a picture in our head of, the pleasant walk and, everyone is like strolling for leisure to kind of get to where they need to go. But whenever you start talking about the diversity of the different types of communities that are out there, thinking about transit-oriented development is more than putting housing next to a train station. There has to be very thoughtful integration of uses so that people have places to go and things to do in their local communities, because you can't have a 15-minute community if there's no grocery store nearby. I'm fortunate that I live in Boston without a car, and I can walk to 3, 4 grocery stores within 15 minutes. That's what a 15-minute community looks like. That's what transit-oriented development looks like. I also have access to 2 trains and a bus line. Bus line stops literally around the corner from my house. Trains are all within 10-minute walks. And so this is what we're talking about when it comes to, how do we plan our development? But one of the things we have to keep in mind is that, instead of going into a community and just making it walkable or making it so that, we're putting more activities near the rail station, there also has to be other amenities such as open green space. that allow for people to use the space in a multitude of ways. We also have to think about the fact that not everyone commutes to a 9-to-5 job. And so how do we make sure that these 15-minute cities are also at least 15-hour cities when it comes to, the types of activities you can do it and the time spent over which you can do them. Because if there are times when you can't go to any place because nothing is open, it doesn't make for the level of vibrancy and activity that's needed to create transit-oriented development. And so I think that the trends in transit-oriented development is that as we develop local communities to be more transit-oriented and walkable, that they should also include multiple modes of transportation, that cars can also get through safely, but also car sharing programs is something that we should talk a little bit more about as well, because there are times when you need a car. And so in having multiple places where I can access a Zip car or other types of car sharing services, that gives me the freedom to actually be able to have the resources that I need without having to invest in my own car ownership, because I don't have a place to park it, which is another thing that we should also keep in mind, that because we don't want to be spending our real estate dollars on developing parking spaces. We do know that in a lot of our communities, especially like if we start looking at our gateway cities, we have some communities where around the rail stations, 65% of the land area is devoted to car infrastructure. That's roads, parking garages, parking lots, car washes, gas stations. And then we also have, also in our cities, the land is just too valuable for us to be spending, $30,000 for a parking space. And so, we need to be more creative as to how we think about developing transit-oriented development.
Great, thank you. Geraldine, we've been talking a lot about affordability and equity in development of EVs. How is GM ensuring that its EV fleet is economically accessible to people?
Well, thank you, John. As I mentioned before, right, we are making sure that we have a broad range, of options for people, starting with Volt, that's very economical way to all the way to the Hammer EV. But we are also, as many of you may know, we are majority owner of Cruise Automation. And with Cruise Automation, we are trying to tackle some of the issues around city transit. It's not like massive transit, but when we talk about share and connected, right, solutions, we're committing to improve life in our cities. That is why Cruise, we and GM, we are designing the Origin. It's a car the size of an SUV, that it will be, autonomous, it will be electric, and people will be able to use it similar to an Uber or similar. So that is designed to be an affordable, comfortable, and scalable solutions in our cities. With the Origin's ability to drive day and night, and last more than 1 million miles. Usually our cars now, we put in the cars 150,000 miles, but the Origin, it is designed to last way more. We're able to, we estimate that we will be able to cut like up to $5,000 in transportation costs, for example, in cities like San Francisco per year. So although we have our products, the car products, and we are trying to be equitable, looking at a price range, not just a catering to certain sections, of our customers. We are also, when we look at the problems in cities and how we're thinking about resolving those, we are working with a Cruise to make solutions like the Origin a reality.
Great, thank you. I see a question from the audience relating to what other places in the United States and even around the world are doing to promote electric vehicles and transit. So just on the electric vehicle front, I'll start with one of the cities that I talk about in Greenovation is London, which is a real leader in terms of developing the charging infrastructure. And because London consists of independent boroughs, there's a lot of decision making to be made. But we just think of it in terms of, well, more chargers. But when you think about a city like London with historic neighborhoods, just like Boston, there's an issue of creating street clutter by having all these charging stations around. And how do you integrate those into neighborhoods, historical neighborhoods? And it's really interesting. London, as well as Amsterdam, are experimenting with lamp poles, since they already have electricity in them, and doing very inconspicuous chargers. So that's something I look to. London is also, many of you might have heard about London's congestion charging, where it's taken a large area of London, and cars entering at rush hour have to pay a fee. The fee is higher at lunch or at key commuting times. And what they're doing now is overlaying what's called an ULEV, ultra light electric vehicle district, over that. And over time, only electric vehicles will be allowed into that district, but charging them. So those are kind of the carrots and sticks that cities can use. Another city that I look to going to the United States is one of my favorite green cities that surprises some people, is Los Angeles. And Los Angeles was the first, and I believe the only city that's committed a time frame for all of its buses to be electric. And they're being manufactured there by 2 manufacturers as well as they have Blue LA, which is a electric vehicle program that the city has, that it's starting out in its low-income neighborhoods, heavily subsidizing that so that EVs aren't just something for the rich. So those are a couple of examples I can think of. Tracy, I bet you might have 1 or 2 yourself.
Yeah, I have to admit, I have a hard time thinking of like really good examples of kind of what's happening, kind of in some of the smaller and mid-sized cities that majority of folks live in. But I do recall when I was in Seattle of there being a very concerted effort. It was actually a multi-state effort between California, Oregon, Washington State, and British Columbia and Canada to actually invest in through a public-private partnership into putting in charging infrastructure all along the I-5 corridor, which is the entire Western United States. And so to kind of see that kind of initiative, I think that there are a lot of large cities that are doing work like that. But I realize that people are living in more smaller, mid-sized cities. They're having a bit of a challenge. But I do know that there is a city here in Massachusetts that is looking at ways in which to kind of boost its as a smaller city. I don't know if I can actually say who they are, but I'm just going to kind of keep it under wraps for now. They're actually in the process of assessing the development of a municipal car sharing fleet that would be electric. And so I'm looking at how to kind of make sure that the grid can actually handle it. Because one of the things we know in some of our older cities, especially in older settled parts of the country like New England, you have this older infrastructure, and a lot of that infrastructure is having some challenges. And so I think that, as we think about kind of ways in which to just improve access to this infrastructure, we need to think about the interconnections between the charging infrastructure and other infrastructures within our cities and towns. As you were mentioning, you said that it's not just about the street clutter and the kind of the historic kind of feel of some of our older cities, but also how do we kind of the crumbling, literal, gas explosions and water pipes crumbling and electric grids going, electricity and broadband going out. I mean, these are real issues that we need to tackle. And so if we can think about ways in which we can kind of develop our electric infrastructure and our electric vehicle infrastructure in a way that also helps improve some of these more urgent questions of things like clean water and heat, I think that will help us kind of get to being able to better serve communities more equitably across all of our communities across the country.
Great, thank you. So So that seems to suggest my examples and your secret city example, some policies that maybe aren't in place in Massachusetts, Senator. So let me ask you a two-part question. What else do we need to do? What hasn't been in those bills? And, you know, what could we be doing that others around the world or the country are doing? And then related to that, you talked about transforming electric vehicle fleets by 2035. It seems like a long way off. Is that because it's just a natural replacement after the vehicles have lived their lives? Or why couldn't that be done before 2035?
Well, thank you, John. It's a great question. And I guess I'll start with the second question. I think a lot of the Commonwealth's fleet purchases are, they're financed, they're done on leases. So this will say that as we build into the next generation of fleets in the Commonwealth, as we get out of those old leases and bring new leases online, we got to make sure all leases, all purchase options are electric or zero emission vehicles by 2035. So, these vehicles can be more costly. So we don't want to just spring it on small municipalities who are going to be required to do the same whether they purchase their fleets without giving them time to plan economically and phase in a program like this. I think Massachusetts, to answer your first question, is really a bold leader in so many things. I mean, in education, we're number one from K through 12. In medical care, we're first in the nation. But unfortunately, we're first in the nation in congestion too. So there are things we need to take, bold steps really we need to take into the future. And that's why I filed the Transportation New Deal, because it really sets out the initial set of policies that Massachusetts must take to move the Commonwealth forward. And it includes, policies like a fare-free MBTA bus and regional transit authority buses, just fare-free, serving people across the socioeconomic scale. Low-income fares on MBTA's commuter rail system. We need to look at the commuter rail system no longer as a commuter rail system, but more as a regional rail system. Not just a train that comes into Boston in the morning and leaves Boston at night. Because we know, as Tracy has stated before, not everyone works a 9 to 5 anymore. And if people that do, if they have to get home for their children or home for an aging parent in the middle of the day, they're going to have that access. So by creating more frequency on our regional rail service, I think it'll go a long way in incentivizing people to get out of their cars and onto public transportation. So there are many policies that we can pilot in the Commonwealth. You mentioned before, pricing congestion, kind of putting a price on, travel. And, it's funny, countries or cities like London that you mentioned, countries like Singapore are already doing it, but it's happening right here in the United States too. Of the 10 major metros across this country, all have some sort of pricing program, congestion pricing program, except for Greater Boston and Massachusetts. So we need to take the bold step. I mean, if you talk to any transportation expert on how to reduce congestion in your city or in your state, the number one answer they'll tell you is put a price on congestion. Congestion is really a nonlinear equation. It's a capacity issue. When the roads reach their capacity, as they do each and every morning pre-pandemic in Massachusetts, you have congestion. But if it's also a nonlinear equation, which means if you can remove just 5% of the cars from our roads, you'll help congestion by 20%, because it's really the last few cars on the roadway. So if we can incentivize, just a few people in the Commonwealth to be more conscientious about how they're traveling and when they're traveling, and incentivize them with road pricing to travel during off-peak hours, we can move the Commonwealth forward, move the economy forward, and really reduce our greenhouse gas emissions that are tied to sitting in congestion.
Great, thank you. A lot of policy goals we need to do. There's one more thing I wanted to talk about very briefly, but Geraldine, I'm sorry, we only have a minute. Could you talk a little bit about your goals of inclusivity in either your China or Mexico facility? And again, we only have 1 minute left.
Yeah, well, I'm going to be very brief, and I am going to talk about, a global goal that we have at GM. We want to be the most inclusive company in the world. That is the bar that our CEO has set for us, and we are doing all in our power to work in each one of the countries and evaluate, right, what meaning the most inclusive company in that particular geography means. Inside and outside the company, and implementing accordingly.
Okay, thank you. All right, so now we will turn to the moment we've been waiting for, and I'll ask Tracy and Geraldine to turn off your video and audio, and we will go to Senator Boncory, who for the past 3 years has announced the winner of the Designing for a Sustainable Future. So we will turn the program over to you now for making that announcement.
Thank you so much, Joan, and thank you for moderating a really robust panel discussion. And hopefully it was an appetizer for the main course that we have now, because now I have the honor of presenting the top proposals in this year's Go Carbon Neutral Challenge as determined by our judging panel. Each and every year for the past 3 years that I've come to this event, it's really been incredible to watch it grow. And as a policymaker, as Senate Chair of the Transportation Committee in the Commonwealth, I have to say, I look forward to this event every year. I think I learn a lot. It really puts a fresh perspective on some age-old problems that are ailing transit systems in states and across the country. So this year's competition and competitors were scored by 3 judges each. And those scores were weighted with public vote to determine their final placement. Now, in previous years, we had ranked winners in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd place. But this year, all top 3 winners will be recognized in no particular order, and all will receive a cash prize. Now on with the show. Judges praised our first winner this evening for the ambition and planning within their proposal. An excellent combination of access and technology to reduce carbon emissions. Lauren Wright and Jerry Garfunkel Vargas for Team Bolt. I appreciate your equitable approach to providing greater connectivity and transit options across North Carolina. Congratulations to Team Bolt. Also receiving our next winning team this evening was praised by judges for an original proposal that targets young people, considered multiple perspectives and approaches to create a culture change, and their ideas around gamification and social cohesion. Also receiving a cash prize from UCal Berkeley, we have Cindy Wong and Chu Yuhu for Team Making Navigation Apps Green. I really appreciated your proposal that assists commuters of being more conscientious about reducing their greenhouse gas emissions and carbon footprint, and being conscientious about transportation decisions. Congratulations to Team Making Navigation Apps Green. And now, our final cash prize winner this evening. You saw them earlier this evening as a popular vote winner, and the judges agreed. They were praised for their energy, their primary research and logical approach to transit solutions. Angela Zong, Carrie Traylor, and Michael Omole of Team MAC, Scale the Rail. We appreciate your proposal to prioritizing transportation access for environmental justice communities and communities of color. And I want to let you know that I share your vision for an MBTA system that is more equitable, more accessible, and more reliable. Congratulations to you, Team Mac. And I want to congratulate all of the competitors. Our Commonwealth and our country is better because you're thinking in this way. The future of transportation is in your hands, and we'll be looking forward to seeing you meet the goals of equity, accessibility, reliability, and of course, sustainability in our transportation system into the future. And now I want to turn it back to my dear friend, Tim Ritchie, for some closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Boncory, and congratulations also on behalf of the museum to all the Go Carbon Neutral winners and to all the participants. Press on with your passion for a sustainable future. Press on with your ideas. We are counting on you. I'd also like to thank Joan Fitzgerald, Tracy Corley, Geraldine Barnuevo, and Senator Joe Boncory. It was a wonderful discussion, thrilling to hear all of the ideas for how we can live sustainably on Earth. Really the quality of thinking at the legislative level, at the academic level, at the industry level. This is what we need to do as a community, to bring together these four sectors together with the general public to imagine a future that can come about if we put our collective will to that. So thank you to everyone for being here tonight. Thank you for our audience. Please expect this kind of thing from the Museum of Science, because among the things we want to be is a convening space for public science engagement. And what could be more important than to create a future that is sustainable? Thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful Earth Day and an Earth evening, I suppose. Good night.